All right, we're moving closer to the cross here, but a lot of stuff. Jesus does a lot of the recording teaching of Jesus is right before the crucifixion. So it's just a lot of material in here. We talked a little bit last week about this and spoke about them binding God's word on their forehead and their forearm, and how they took that literally, and how Jesus criticized them not for doing this necessarily, but for making them bigger. Where they could be seen by people, making them larger, the tassels of their garments. He says that you like to have the chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, respectful greetings in the marketplaces, being called rabbi by men. So there was a lot of prestige to being a teacher, a Jewish rabbi or priest. A lot of honor came with that, and as with often happens with that, people they desired that praise more than they thought about their position, and that was a bad, that was hypocritical. Jesus condemned them for that. He said you should have been servant leaders, and you shouldn't have been people who lorded over others, which is what Jesus often accused them of them being hypocritical in how they act. He said, "Do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you will be your servant." So what does he mean? That's what Jewish teachers were called in the day of Christ, weren't they? They were called rabbi. That was their title. That's what they were. He says, don't call them rabbi. He says, don't call anyone father. Does that mean you can't call your father father? Does that mean, what's he mean by that? He says, do not be called leaders. Well, there's leaders in that day, right? Other leaders in that day. So did Jesus say just never use those terminologies, never use those titles at all? Is that what he's saying? Is that I can't say that anymore? Can't call them rabbi? They are. That is what they are, right? They're a rabbi, right? Isn't that what they are? I can't say that anymore. What's he mean by that? I mean, I'm not supposed to call my father, but I call my father father. I mean, right? Um, right. I don't. Right. So a lot of it's contextual, isn't it? How do you use it? What's your thought when you use these words? Good words are important, right? And words have meaning, and how we use words and contextually how we use words is important, isn't it? Jesus is saying, don't refer to these men in this respect, because that's not their role. That's not who they are. Understand who really is your teacher, who really is your leader, who really is your father. I don't think he says, I think we look at that passage in the Bible where it says, anyone who says fools in danger of hellfire, But we understand it's contextual, right? It's the terminology, how we use it, and who we're referring to, and how we're referring to them. There's a lot of things go into words, terminology, and I think we all understand that. And Jesus says we need to be careful of our words, careful of the titles we place upon people, and of the names we call people, because that can, if it's irreverent to God, if it's irreverent to Christ, then we shouldn't do that, you see. So I think that's it's something that Jesus says, be careful. Choose your titles. Choose who you're putting titles on. He wants them to be servant leaders, doesn't he? The greatest among you will be your servant. Because Jesus, isn't that what Jesus said? I didn't come to serve or to be served, but to serve and to offer my life as a ransom for many. Jesus says, I'm the example, to be a servant leader, not to be a leader who just sits up there and does things, but to be a leader who serves, to humble yourself among men. And he says, because this is exactly what the scribes and Pharisees don't do. He says, you shut off the kingdom of heaven for people, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. How can they shut it off? And what's he saying? What's they shutting him off from? The kingdom of heaven, right? Didn't say shutting them off from Judaism. Am I right here? Says he shut them off from the kingdom of heaven. And he doesn't let those with him to go in. Why does he say, how are they prohibiting others from going into the kingdom? Yeah, he's not allowing them to follow, not allowing them to follow Christ, right? It's not allowing them to deviate from Judaism, not allowing them to learn what it is and what Christ is and about the kingdom of heaven. So they're denying them entrance by doing that. So he's criticizing them for just not for going in themselves, because that's just on them. But he says you're not allowing those who are entering to go in. Now he says who are entering. In other words, you're not allowing those who are interested in Christ or interested. You're holding them back from learning the truth. You're keeping them by your laws, your traditions, by your society. You're holding them back from becoming Christians, from following the kingdom of heaven. So their criticism here is really severe. He says you devour widow houses for appearance sake and offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. You devour widows' houses. That's in all three Gospels, isn't it? What does that mean? How are they devouring widows' houses? Yeah, widows in that time, right? If there wasn't a male heir, they were kind of at the mercy of society, at the mercy of things, at the mercy of these priests or those ones that had money and had authority, right? And so they would wind up taking their property to support them or to do it, or they would somehow coerce them out of that. But I think that is an example of a bigger problem, right? In other words, he's not just saying, well, you're doing this to widows, which is bad. But it says they're using their position for what? They're using their position to get what? Gain. Absolutely. You're using your position for gain. In other words, you're not just, if they were going in to help a widow and do what they should do in God's eyes and to take care of that widow in God's eyes, and somehow the temple wound up with the house, that would probably be one thing. But that's not what he says. He says you're devouring them. In other words, you're taking them by disadvantage. You're not giving them their due for what it is. You're using it, like Clyde says, you're using it to get personal gain, to gain more wealth for yourself. Well, shame on you for that, right? Jesus condemns them for that. Says you should be a servant leader. You shouldn't be in this to try to make gain or to make money. So he goes into the woes of Matthew. And I think it's Matthew 23 that's where we go to the woes. The 7 woes. Actually, I think there's only 6 because one's actually a textual variant. But 7 woes of Matthew 23. So, and all these are things that he criticizes them for. And the first thing he criticizes them, he says, you travel on land and sea to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. That's a pretty big statement, isn't it? So, number one, what's a proselyte? Yeah, convert to Judaism. They were called proselytes. You proselyted in to be a Jew. So if you wanted to be a Jew, even today, if you decide that you wanted to be a Jew today, you could proselyte in. You could convert to Judaism. And that seems kind of like a weird thing to say because Jews are Abraham's descendants, right? Isaac's descendants. But if you wanted to become a Jew, you could proselyte into Judaism. The Ethiopian eunuch was probably a proselyte, more than likely. He probably was not a Jew, a born Jew. He was probably a proselyte. He was also a eunuch, which put him at a double disadvantage in Judaism, right? But proselytes were never true Jews, okay? It ain't like Christianity. When you become a Christian, you're a true Christian. Doesn't matter. Proselytes to Judaism, even though they would accept the Jewish faith and take the Jewish customs and believe in God and do all these things, they were never truly a true Jew. They always were a little bit on the outside, okay? But they would convert them to proselyte, but then he says you make them twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. That's a really big thing coming from what Jesus says. You know, so he says when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. What does he mean? What does Jesus mean by that? What is he trying to say here? So they go and they proselyte someone to Judaism, but he says they're twice as bad as they are. I think Jesus would say the student's not above the teacher, right? Don't you? I think he would say that if you convert someone wrong, then what have you done? So, you know, I think it's what he means. He's like, if you're doing it wrong and you convert them wrong, then they're twice as bad off as you are. You know, you've basically condemned them by what you've done, by your teaching, by what you've taught them to do. That really puts a lot of pressure on teachers, I think, and preachers. And I don't know if all preachers feel the weight of that. I know I do. You know, James says we shouldn't desire to be teachers, right? Because we receive a greater condemnation, right? So elders get twice the crown, preachers get twice the condemnation. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's how God played it out, right? But anyway, so it's a weight that you put upon yourself as a teacher. He says, woe to you blind guides. He says, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. And this goes into oaths, and Jesus criticized them in other places for their oaths. He said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. You know, don't swear by the temple, don't swear by the altar. But in Judaism, it's like when we were little kids, right? We would swear, and then if we was really serious about it, we'd pinky swear, right? And if we was really serious about it, we'd do a blood oath, wouldn't we? Remember that? Jay's laughing. Yeah. I guess you got to be of our generation. I'm sure kids today be like, I ain't sticking myself in anything. Back then we were like, blood, cool. Let's share. Yeah. But we were really weird kids. But anyway, but it would go up, right? You used to say, swear by your mother, right? Or swear by whatever, you know, because we wanted it to be something that we knew they weren't going to break. Well, it was that way in Judaism, apparently, from what I read, and that certain things they would swear by weren't real binding. They would swear by it, but it wasn't real binding. But certain things they swore by would be more binding. So Jesus criticized me. He said, if you say it, it should be that way. You shouldn't have to swear on something, right? In other words, if you swear on the temple, then you don't really have to honor that. But if I swear by the gold in the temple, well, that's I got to honor that. You know, he says your word ought to be your word, right? You're a hypocrite. Woe to you, you fools and blind men. Which is more important, the gold or the temple sanctified the gold? So, you know, Jesus criticized. Whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar? There, whoever swears by the altar swears by both the altar and everything on it. Whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. So so he criticizes them for that, and he tells them that they should. Your yes should be yes, your no should be no. You shouldn't have to do that. If you swear by heaven, swear by both the throne of God and by him who sits on it. So, and then he goes to another woe. Woe to you, hypocrites. You tithe the mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the weighty provisions of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. But these are things you should have done without neglecting the others. And I think that's the part of that I always missed in that statement. He doesn't really criticize them for doing the tithing of their spices. He doesn't criticize. He says you should have done that, but you neglected the others, right? You neglected the weightier things of the law. I think that speaks a lot about Judaism, doesn't it? How they were so observant of certain aspects of the law. To tithe your spices, that seems like really something to me, doesn't it? I was watching something the other day I thought was kind of interesting, and it was of a rabbi, and he was going into these people's houses before Passover, and they had cleaned up, their houses were clean, you know, because they clean everything before Passover. I didn't realize how serious that was in Orthodox Judaism. I was reading the other day, today, you know, in our world today. But I was reading a thing, and they were going into how they cleaned every room, started with the furthest rooms out, and worked their way to the kitchen, and absolutely cleaned everything in the rooms, cleaned everything in the kitchen, cleaned their cars out, cleaned their cars, anything that could have anything with leaven, how they absolutely cleaned everything. And then they even said that if you had rental properties that people lived in, because it's still your property, right? But you couldn't necessarily make them clean all the leaven. You couldn't do all that. So for Passover, you would sell that to another Jew or to somebody else for like $1, and then you bought it back after Passover. So technically, you didn't own it. And I thought, man, that's really strict, isn't it? That's really strict. And then I was watching something the other day of this rabbi, and this guy literally, I'm not going to call it a flamethrower, but it was like this tube that blew flame. That's a flamethrower, right? I mean, it wasn't like we think a flamethrower, like it wasn't destructive, right? It was more like a flame poofer than a flamethrower. But he was going into these houses, and all the cabinets were open and the ovens, and he was going over their countertops and in their ovens and everything with this flame poofer, right? And he said he did 4 houses a night to burn any other that they had missed, to burn that out. Now that's serious, isn't it? I mean, that's really being observant of the law, right? I mean, that's as strict as you can get. I mean, that's how strict these people were, and that's hard for you and I as Christians. I think it's kind of hard for us to wrap our head around. You know, that's strictly observing what God commands. That's as strict as you can do it. Clean the leaven out of your house. Isn't that what the law says, right? Clean the leaven for 7 days. Clean the leaven out of your house. Well, how do you take that, right? Does that mean I just do a good cleaning and it's all right? Well, apparently not, right? So when he criticizes them here of the spices, tithing their spices, that would take a while in my house, you know, because we got a lot of spices in my house, but that's super observant of the law. And the amazing thing is, Jesus doesn't criticize them. He doesn't say, well, you're taking that way too far, right? But he says, listen, you're not observing the things that are more important. You're so concerned about the little things, you've forgotten the big things. Doesn't Jesus say that all the time? He says, you know, you strain a gnat and swallow a camel. We always say that in our society, right? You strain a gnat, you swallow a camel. You know, we get so concerned about the little things that we forget the big things. Jesus says, you know, you're worried about the speck in your brother's eye, but you don't worry about the log in your own eye. So he says you need to not be so concerned about, or not be concerned about little things, but be concerned about the big things. You strain out a gnat and you swallow a camel. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup of the dish, but inside they're full of robbery and self-indulgence. First clean the inside of them so that the outside may become clean also. He criticized them of being dirty on the inside, clean on the outside. You clean the outside of stuff, ceremonial washing, but you don't clean the inside. Worry about the inside. and then the outside will take care of itself. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees! You're like whitewashed tombs. On the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanliness. They whitewashed tombs so they wouldn't accidentally touch them, because that would make them unclean. And he uses this as a comparison. He says, you're like that on the outside. You're whitewashed, but on the inside you're full of dead men's bones. You appear righteous, but inwardly you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you build the tombs of prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. He said, you build the tombs of the prophets, but your people, your descendants, your ancestors, are the ones who killed them. You know, they treated the prophets terrible in Jewish history. The great prophets that you and I revere as Old Testament prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all those guys that we think so much of, the major prophets, the minor prophets, all those people that spoke God's word, they were terribly, terribly used and abused. They didn't want to hear what those men had to say. It's interesting, isn't it, what Jesus says? He says, I think it resonates with mankind. He says, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the shedding the blood of the prophets. You know, there's been so many atrocities committed throughout history, hasn't there? I mean, if you just let your mind think just a little bit. Genocides, right? Wars. So many things all the time. Tragedies that occurred. And we always look back, I think, sometimes, and we say, boy, that was really stupid, right? If I'd have been there, things would have been different. And Jesus says, probably not. Right? You're thinking way too much of yourselves, right? You think that you would have done different than other people did. But people are people, right? People are people. If you put us in that place in society, I don't know who I would have been in the first century Jerusalem. I think I probably would have been a Pharisee, more than likely, just being honest. You don't know how you would have acted at that point, any point in history, how you would have responded, but humanity's humanity. Humankind is humankind. Mankind is mankind. And we can't set ourselves on a pedestal and say, oh, well, I would never have done that. Well, yeah, maybe you would have, right? Jesus says you're sitting there saying you're more righteous than them because you wouldn't have done it. You should understand that we're none of us righteous. Isn't that what Jesus is saying? If you would have been back there, you would have done the same thing. Your ancestors did this. You're just like them. You would have done exactly the same thing. You're trying to make yourself righteous, like you're building them this big ornate temple or this monument and saying, oh, we wouldn't have done that. Jesus says you're thinking way more highly of yourselves than you need to think. Right? You might have done that. Don't overestimate yourself. It's really nice to live in a wonderful place in history where you don't maybe have to deal with the conflicts that other people deal with. That's really a nice place. But the truth is that we don't always have that benefit. And how are we going to react in a state of conflict? How are we going to react when things don't go the way we think they should? Well, mankind is mankind, right? Jesus says, don't think more highly of yourself. Don't think that you're better than the people that were before you, because you're not. Everybody's flawed. Everybody has problems, and don't think you're better than them, because you're not. Accept the guilt. Accept the fact that you're not perfect, that you're not righteous, that you could make the same mistakes that other people make. Absolutely. And I think he's criticizing them for that. And he says, because you don't understand the guilt within you, the unrighteousness within you, you can't escape hell. Because the only way you can escape hell is to understand that you're not perfect, to understand that you have to repent, to understand that you got to turn to God. You can't escape it by your own righteousness. You can't escape by saying, well, look at me, look how good I am. Well, I would have never done that. No, you can't say that. You don't know how you would have acted in the same situation at the same time. You don't know. I don't know. It's like that thing that says, oh, I'd push somebody out of the way of a moving bus to save their lives. Would you? I don't know. I mean, I would like to think I'm that guy. But until there's some bus barreling down on somebody and I got to make that call, I don't know that I'm that guy. Do you really know you're that person until you have to make the call? Do you? I don't think you do. I mean, you can think the best of yourself all day. I like to think the best of myself too, but I'll be honest, I've been in situations I haven't been my best. Right? So I'm no better than anybody else. I'm no better than the people who lived before me. I'm just in a different time and place in history, and I'm living my life, and they live their lives, and I'm not perfect or any better than they were. I can't look at them and criticize them for what they did because I wasn't there. Right? Were you? I wasn't there. You know, that's what we do in history. We look back and condemn people all the time. We condemn them. Say, well, I wouldn't have done that. You know, if I'd have lived in early colonial America, I wouldn't have been a slaveholder. Well, would you? I don't know. Would you have been? A lot of people were. They didn't think it was a bad thing. I mean, you think it's a bad thing because you look back and think it's a bad thing, but they thought it was all right. Right? I mean, you don't know that. So where do we pay? You know, so we can't put ourselves above the people that went before us. We can't look back at them and think, well, I wouldn't make those same mistakes, because we probably will. So Jesus is saying, don't puff yourself up and think you're better, because you're not. It's your ancestors made that. Accept the guilt of yourself. Accept the fact that you're not perfect. Accept the fact that you can make mistakes. Accept the fact that without God, you're lost. You have to repent and turn to God, because nobody's perfect. All have sinned and fall short of God's glory. But they don't look at themselves that way, because they think they're better than them before him. He says, no, you're not. He says, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to do the same thing. And you're going to think you're right doing it. You're going to think you're doing the right thing. When you kill these men, when you kill James in just a little few years, you're going to kill James, right? When you stone Stephen to death, when you murder all of my apostles, when you kill all these Christians, you're going to think you're doing the right thing, but you're not. So don't think you're better than your fathers, because you're not better than your fathers. And Jesus is trying to point that out. He says, and upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth. The blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Bechi, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. He's leading up to the destruction of Judaism here, is what he's doing. He's leading up to the destruction of Judaism. Now, I know Judaism still exists. I understand that. But Judaism, essentially, when Jesus hung on the cross, Judaism, in God's eyes, ceased to exist, even though it still exists on this earth. It doesn't exist in God's eyes. And he's leading up to the death of that. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. Your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We're right at the crucifixion, this teaching in the temple. This is the last time he's going to be teaching in the temple. This is the last day of this. This is the week of the crucifixion. So he's saying, you know, you're not going to see me this way again until you see me in the kingdom, until you see me in my glory. Big statement, and we're leading up in a lot heavier passage of Matthew, but we're not there yet. But he's leading into that. We're going to have a little discourse here in the temple before we get to that point. So we're still in the temple, right? But he's really leading up to what he's going to tell them on in Matthew 23, 24. So are there any comments there? This is a story we look at a lot, and I always look at it a lot. I think it's really interesting the whole setting. And I think you got to put yourself in the temple to really understand this story, this that Jesus tells, or the story that's written it for us. The temple's magnificent, number one. The temple's amazing. It's the pride of the Judaism, pride of the Jews. It's Herod's temple, we call it. It was it's actually the second temple, because Solomon's temple was destroyed. And then Nehemiah and Ezra came back and built the second temple. And the second temple was still standing. But before Jesus was born, okay, Herod, wanting to appease the Jews, because that was part of Herod's claim to being king. We're talking about Herod the Great. Part of Herod the Great's journey to be king was reigning in Judaism, reigning in this area of the world, appeasing the Jews, right? Taking care of this conflict, making people get along. And if you're going to make the Jews happy, the best thing you can do is fix their temple, right? And Herod didn't care about God, okay? And Herod didn't care about the Jews, except he wanted them to be happy because he wanted to have peace. So Herod decided that he would rebuild the Jewish temple. So he started doing this, and this was probably about a 50-year project. This was really big, 40, 50-year project, and he went on beyond the death of Herod the Great, because Herod the Great died in about 4 B.C., but it started before Jesus was born, and the temple was technically still under construction when Jesus hung on the cross, okay? Wasn't done yet when Jesus hung on the cross. The temple wasn't completed until in the early 40 BCs. Jesus probably hung on the cross in about 30, right, AD, about 30 AD, and the temple wasn't completed until about 43, 44 AD. So the temple was really still under construction when Jesus was, the main part of the temple, to my understanding, was completed. The main part where they did the sacrifice, all that stuff was completed. But the outer courts and the outer walls and stuff like that were actually still under construction when Jesus was here teaching. So the temple's magnificent. It's been redone. Herod spent tons of money on it, right? And it's beautiful. It's magnificent. And the way I understand it from reading Edersheim, which I would recommend you never read because it's like reading a piece of dirt. But it is that the temple, when people went into the temple, there was big coffers, big metal coffers, basins, that they threw the money into, because the money was coinage. We know that from Jesus, right? Whose image is on this coin? It didn't have paper money. Money was coinage. And so this coins would ring when you would throw them into this metal basin. And people apparently would sit in this colonnade or this foyer, whatever you would call it, into this main part of the temple, and would watch these people throw in their offering, because if it was really made a big noise, it was like, wow, look at all that person threw in, right? So it was kind of a show. And they didn't just go up and put it in, they would throw it into there so you would know how much they were giving. And so if you kind of put yourself in that situation, place yourself in there, the story makes a lot more sense. Because Jesus and apostles, they're in this colonnade, in this entrance into the temple, and where this offering is being presented. And it's interesting that he sits down opposite the treasury. See, people would just sit and watch, sit and observe. It was kind of a show. Didn't have Netflix back in those days, right? It was kind of a show. And so Jesus was doing that. And he began observing how the people were putting money to the treasury, and many rich people were putting in large sums. And Mark tells us that. The rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And then he sees the poor widow. You really need to read Mark 43, verse 43. I think 43 is what I like. It says, calling his disciples to them. I think that's really neat, So they're all in there, right? They're all in this colonnade. They're all watching what's going on, busy, people coming in, throwing in money. And Jesus is watching all these people throwing in their large sums or their money. But when he sees this widow, and in my mind, I always picture her just kind of staying out of the way, sneaking along, right? Don't really want to be, doesn't want to be seen because, all these people are doing this big thing. She's going to throw in her penny. Tink, nobody wants a tink. You know what I'm saying? and so I just can see that she doesn't want to be seen, I don't think. And yet Jesus sees her, and I think it's really fascinating. Jesus calls his disciples over to see her. Of all this money, all these people, Jesus, this is the one. God sees us, doesn't he? God sees the widow. And it's just fascinating to me that Jesus calls them over. He says, look at this woman. Look at this widow. We don't know her name or anything about her. My grandmother, when I was growing up, I know I taught my grandmother a lot. Y'all probably get tired of it, but it's something that's in my history. So that's a bad thing about having a preacher for 15 years. You know most of my stories. You're going to hear them again. It's like that joke that somebody's told you 4 times. They come in and say, "You heard that joke?" Yeah, I heard that. You told me like 4 times. But anyway, but she used to carry this little change purse in her deal. She had no money, She just had a little Social Security. That was it. And but she used to carry her stuff in this little change purse. And I can remember on Sunday, every Sunday, she'd pull that little coin purse, had that little snap clip on it, pull that out of her purse and unsnap that, and she'd take her money out and she'd put it in that offering every Sunday. She didn't have anything, and it always reminds me of the widow's mite. I'm not going to say she put in all she had, but everything she put in was something she needed. I mean, she missed what she put in there. She missed it, right? I'll be honest with you. I think you should miss what you put in the plate. But this widow, she puts in all she has, it says. It just fascinates me. It says, out of her poverty, Jesus says, out of her poverty, put in all she owned, all she had to live on. What's her mindset? Right? What's her mindset when she does that? Have you ever really thought about that? I mean, here's these basins that are full of money, right? People are throwing it in. She could have said, well, they don't need more money. They didn't, right? It's all took care of. I just would like to talk to this widow, wouldn't you? I would like to talk to her about what she was thinking when she did that. How she thought she was going to get by the next day or the next little bit. How she had faith and relied on God that he was going to take care of her, even when she put that in. I don't know. This is a great story, isn't it? We give out of our poverty, we give out of our prosperity, or we give out of our poverty. Which does God desire, right? Which makes more of an impact on God? To give out of our prosperity or to give out of our poverty? I don't know that it matters to God. I think what matters is, did we give what we had? Do we feel it? Do we sacrifice to give it? If Bill Gates gave $1 billion, he'd still live just like he lives. I mean, it wouldn't change anything. That's a lot of money, isn't it? But that wouldn't impress God at all, would it? I don't think it would. It might impress a lot of people, but it wouldn't impress God because he gave out of his prosperity, didn't he? I don't know. Something to think about. Interesting story. Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Depends on why you do it, on your sacrifice. Yeah, I absolutely agree. We got to move out of the temple now. Remember, he says, you're not going to see me again until you see me coming. He was in the temple talking, and then we get the widow's mite, which is the treasury of the temple. Day's coming to an end. Jesus is leaving the temple. His disciples, apostles are leaving the temple with him. He's going up onto the top, up onto this mount. And this is where we get this discourse in Matthew 24, which is probably the most prevalent discourse of this, although Luke 21 is a really good synoptic of that. As Jesus came out, the temple was going away. His disciples came up to point out the temple. So he's going up on this hill. The temple's magnificent. You can kind of get the picture. It's probably evening, the sun's setting. Sun's coming across the temple. It's beautiful building, beautiful. And they're pointing it out to Jesus. Look how beautiful this is. Look how wonderful it is. What wonderful buildings. And Jesus makes this statement. He says, as for these things you're looking at, the day will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down. So they're looking at this temple, how big it is, magnificent, permanent, the seat of Judaism, right? And he says, but I'm telling you, the day's coming when not known what one stone will be left on another. Not one stone's going to be there that's not going to be torn down. This thing's going to be destroyed. And he's true. This is exactly what's going to happen. And there's no temple in Jerusalem today. There's no stone left on a stone of the temple in Jerusalem today. It's totally annihilated. The only thing you see when you see that Wailing Wall and the people and Jews at the Wailing Wall, when you see the picture in Jerusalem, there we go. That's the word I'm looking for. That's the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. The temple's 100% gone. This is going to get a lot more interesting next Sunday as we get into this discourse on the temple. End of time, signs of times. We're going to talk about that a little bit next Sunday morning. So thanks for your time this morning.